friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And today I'm going to be making some raspberry sweet rolls. And this is my own recipe that I made up when I wanted to try something different. And what I done was I made a batch of regular cinnamon rolls and took out some of the dough to do an experimentation making these raspberry rolls. I can't call them cinnamon rolls because there's no cinnamon in it. And I'm using my Mother Earth Products freeze-dried raspberries to do this. I love using freeze-dried fruits in making desserts, you know, from cream pies to all kinds of things because they're so easy to work with. And you just powder them up and add them in as your flavoring for whatever. And they're always ready to go. And so another reason why I like to stock up on freeze-dried fruits such as pineapple, mangoes, strawberries, and raspberries, and several more. But those four are the main ones I like to use. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is make my regular yeast dough with a little bit of changes to it. So I'm going to bring you over here and show you how I do that. So unlike a regular sweet dough, I don't put as much sugar in that because I like to save that more for the filling and for the icing that I'm going to put on top. And so I'm going to start off with just 1 cup of flour. I'm using my home milled flour right here to start with. I like to use a half and half blend when I'm doing this kind of bread. And that's just to start off with. And then I'm going to take my dry yeast and put about a tablespoon of that in. And then about a teaspoon of my mineral salt. This is the red mineral salt I've got here. So just about a teaspoon. And then as an extra bonus, just for the sake of health, I like to add in a bunch of seeds. And now's the time I like to do it because I'm going to be letting those seeds soak, especially the flax seed. It really needs to be soaked. So I put in about a tablespoon of each of my seeds. I'll put a little bit more there to this. So I've got flax, poppy. You can put more if you want. You just don't want your bread to end up too heavy. Chia seed, and then flax seed. And this just not only adds a little bit of extra flavor, but like I said, it gives more health benefits because most of your seeds are high in really great minerals that we tend to be lacking often, like magnesium and manganese and so on. And so I always like to find ways to get those in there. And then I'm going to be adding, I've got coconut sugar here, so I'm going to put in a couple of tablespoons of coconut sugar. Coconut sugar is not very sweet at all, but it is, again, another way I can get some more minerals in there. And then I'm going to put a couple of big tablespoons of white sugar, and I'll leave it at that. A lot of times your sweet doughs are going to have a lot more sugar, but again, I'm trying not to go overboard on it there. All right, now I'll take my bread whisk and whisk that all together. So I got the yeast, the salt, the seeds, the 1 cup of flour, and the sugars in there. 120 degrees seems to be the sweet spot for your whatever liquid you're going to add to your yeast to activate it without killing it. You don't want it too hot or it will kill it. So you definitely don't want to go over 125 degrees, but you also, you know, below 115 is usually not going to be hot enough. So I always aim for 120. And so I'm going to measure this back out. I'm using 1 cup of my 120 degree water. And I'm just going to stir that in there real well. Oh, and I forgot one thing. It's going to make it a kind of thick. So this is where you're allowing that yeast to get activated and get real bubbly. And then I like to add a good heaping tablespoon of butter to this as well. So it can, with that warm water, it can melt in there and make it easier to mix in. And that's just a kind of an added benefit that not only adds more flavor, but I think having a good healthy fat in there also helps with the rise overall because it's going to help work with the sugars and the yeast. Okay, so I'll be back when this is ready for the next step. Okay, I'm back. So now I'm going to move on to the next step. And now here's an extra thing that you don't have to do at all either, like the seeds. You can leave those out if you want. And or you can use all 100% just, you know, organic white flour instead of using a whole grain flour like I like to mix in. But I'm going to add about a tablespoon or so of my homemade fermentation starter. This is the one I made with the blueberries and the currants. By adding it in with the dry yeast as well, it just gives the bread more fluffiness and flavor as well. And so if you're interested in my homemade fermentation starter, and I'll go ahead and link to that video here and down below. And also, you can just do a search on my channel for fermenting. I use the fermentation starter for fermenting everything from eggs to vegetables to fruits. But, you know, it's just another way to ferment. It's more, this way is best for using with bread making, fermenting fruits, and making homemade sodas. That's what my favorite thing to use it for. Whereas your salt brine method is going to be a little more preferable for vegetables, but I like using this with the vegetables as well because of the fact that I don't need to use as much salt when I'm doing that. But anyway, so just going to stir that in real good. Okay, now I'm going to start adding the flours in. So I already have a cup of the whole wheat flour, and that's actually wheat and spelt. And then I'm going to add in a cup of the white flour. Again, this is all organic, non-GMO flours that I use. I believe this particular one is the King Arthur, but I did get some from Azure Standard. That once this is all gone, I'll be switching over to that because I got a 50-pound bag. And so what I like to do typically is go back and forth from using, you know, putting in so much of the, let's go for a half cup of the whole wheat now. Because you're going to need about, 4 cups-ish. Obviously, if you know anything about making yeast bread, it's not like a quick bread where you have a specific amount of flour. It's just going to depend. You just add it as you go. Okay, and then when it starts getting to that point that it's sticking to the side of the bowl and you can't really stir it anymore with your bread whisk or fork, then I just dump it out onto my surface. And then what I like to do is take the bowl while I'm doing this, and I'll fill it up with warm water and let it soak. Okay, so now I'll add another half cup of the white flour and just kind of sprinkle it in. I'll probably just go do the rest of it white flour because I'm already to that point that I don't really need to add much more. So you're just going to keep adding that flour and kneading your bread. Basically, when I knead, I use all the methods depending on, everybody has their different style. I just kind of switch it up depending on how it feels. I've been making yeast bread since I was about 15 years old was when I started getting into making yeast breads. 15 or 16, maybe I was 16. I think I was 15 when I started making pies and biscuits. So anyway, I just kind of have my own style and roughly want to knead for about 10 minutes, but that's going to, depending on how vigorous you knead, typically it only takes me about 5 minutes to get my bread to the consistency, the texture that I know it should be, which should be very smooth and elastic. You know, when you go to form it into a ball, it should just make a nice, clean ball. You know, it shouldn't be real lumpy and real sticky. Okay, so this looks really good. And this is just kind of a small batch, and I still haven't decided yet if I'm going to take this and cut it in half and do half of this, just do a small batch of the rolls, and then, you know, a little small loaf of bread, or if I'm going to just make this all into the raspberry rolls. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and wash out that bowl that I just used. I had soaking, remember. I'm going to wash it out, dry it, and then I'm going to be putting the bread in that so that it can rise. Okay, then the next thing I do is take some butter, and then I'm going to put that in there and just spread it around really good. You can use coconut oil if you want, and same thing for the bread itself, for the dough. If you don't want to add butter, add a little bit of coconut oil in there instead. That's going to be a really good option if you can't have dairy. But me, I just really love the flavor that butter adds, especially to the sweet rolls like this. Okay, so now it's ready to go. So I'm going to take my towel, or it's ready to rise. I'm going to take my towel, cover it up so it will keep dust and bugs and stuff out, and I'm going to go set it out in the sun, because even, you know, where we are, it's actually a nice day. We actually have sun, and so that's where I like to set it. It's going to be the warmest area. So any warm area you have in your house, or outside. Just make sure it's well protected where it can rise really well. And it's going to take about an hour, but you might want to check it at about 45 minutes to see where it's at. Depending on how cold it is, it could take a little bit longer. So I'm going to let this rise and I'll be back in just a minute. Now I don't worry too much about cleaning this counter off because I'm going to be rolling that dough out on here anyway, and after it's all done rising, it's actually not as bad of a mess as I usually have. But I want to go ahead while that's rising and move on to the next step, and that is making the raspberry filling for the cinnamon rolls, or for the raspberry sweet rolls. And so what I've got here are my Mother Earth products, freeze-dried raspberries, and then I'm using, you could use a blender if that's easier for you. When I'm doing stuff like this, I prefer to use a coffee grinder. So again, a lot of you have heard me say this. I have a few different coffee grinders. I have like a, an off-grid one, a hand crank one that is sitting on the same table as my grain mill. And then I have two electric ones that I use off my solar power. So one is dedicated specifically for coffee, and this one right here is for use with doing things like this. So what I'm going to do, and I'll link to this particular coffee grinder, but there's all kinds you can find if you want, is I'm going to fill that up about halfway with the freeze-dried raspberries, and then I'm just going to pulverize them in the coffee grinder until they're powdery. All right, and right here I have a half cup of sugar. I may, if I decide to use that whole batch of dough, I may need to add to this. We'll see. Last time I made them, I just did like 5 of them, 5 or 6. But, and so I was really kind of playing it by ear, so I haven't decided yet. I may just go ahead and turn the whole batch into the rolls because they are pretty good. Let me measure it out so I know how much is in here. And if you end up with some kind of chunks in there, that's going to be entirely up to you. Since I'm going to be using this in the filling, I don't mind if there's some pieces that are a little bit bigger. I just want to get it mostly powdered up. Because basically what I'm doing is I'm replacing the cinnamon and the orange peels that I normally put in here, the dried and pulverized orange peels, with the raspberries. So that's about, let's look at it here. That should be about 1/4 cup, which that looks right. We've actually got 3/4 cup total with the sugar and the freeze-dried raspberries. So now I'm just going to take my big fork and then mix this all together. I want to see how that looks color-wise. And yep, that looks about right. So 1/4 cup of the powdered dehydrated raspberries, or strawberries if you wish, or pineapple or mangoes or blueberries or whatever freeze-dried fruits you have on hand. That's about how the color should look. So 1/4 cup of the fruit to 1/2 cup of the sugar, and that should be plenty. I think even if I use the whole batch of dough, that should be plenty. But if not, it's easy enough to make up some more. Now I need to let the dough finish rising before I can come back and roll it out and move on to the next step. But make sure you don't wash this yet. Don't throw it in the sink because you're going to need it again for the icing. So just leave it as is. You're going to need to powder up some more raspberries. Okay, so I'll be back when we're ready to roll that dough out. Okay, well I'm back, and the dough has doubled in size, so it's time for me to punch it down. Now once you've punched your dough down and you've got it, I've kind of got it reshaped right here, it's a good idea to actually let it rest for another 10 minutes before you start working with it, especially if it's a heavier dough like this. But I really need to get busy and get this done. I have a lot going on today, so I'm going to start pressing it out. And I have decided I'm just going to go ahead, since I remembered I did make this smaller. I made this more like I was going to make a single loaf of bread. Last time I did this, I had made the dough 50% bigger than I am doing it this time. So I'm just going to go ahead and make the whole thing the raspberry rolls. So what I'm trying to do is work it into a rectangle, and it's going to be approximately 12 inches wide by 18 inches long is what you want. And make sure you keep your area well floured. Okay, that looks pretty good. It's not perfectly even, but it's good enough. So then what I have here is about 1/4 cup of butter that I have melted, and I'm going to just pour that on there. And then what I like to do is take a pastry brush, one of these silicone brushes in particular, and just Spread that around evenly across the whole surface of the dough. And once I've got that done, I'm now going to take, and this is the right amount for what I've got here. So it's a good thing I got to thinking about it and decided I'm going to use this whole thing for the cinnamon rolls, or for the raspberry rolls. And so you just want to evenly spread your raspberry sugar mixture all across there, and you can just use your fork like I'm doing here, or whatever you got, and just sort of try to even it out. And then if it just you feel like, well, I'd like a little bit more, then you can go ahead and put more. But just consider that if you're going to make an icing to put on top, you don't want to get too carried away with what you're putting in the center. And I wouldn't, this is actually just right here. So remember the amounts that we had there, and then that 1/4 cup of butter, and that's going to be just, that should be just right. And then again, don't wash this because you're going to use this to mix your icing in, and we're going to be making that icing with the raspberries. So now I'm just going to roll this up like so. And I usually don't bother with this, but if you really want, you can pinch your edges together, but I never do that. I just never bother. I like leaving it kind of loose. I've got a pan right here that I like to use when I'm making a decent sized batch of cinnamon rolls or biscuits or anything like this. And it actually was a pan that had a handle on it, but I wanted it to fit into my toaster oven. So Patrick cut off the handle and then just kind of left this little bit here so it'd give me something extra to hang on to. So that's what this is. What I'm doing is I'm heating it up just a little bit so it can get nice and warm. And I'll be putting my rolls in there. So I want to get a good sharp knife so I can cut this. Okay, so we just start cutting. And since I don't have a cutting board under there, I'm going to be very careful not to cut into my countertop. So you can see I'm going about 1.5 inches on width that I'm cutting these. That usually ends up being just about right. Okay, so I got 2, 4, 6, 8, and 9. All right, now that I got my pan just warm enough that I can put a little extra oil in there. I got some coconut oil in there. You can use ghee too, that would be another good thing. Your clarified butter. I'm just wanting it warm. I don't, because I don't want to put the rolls in there cold. And that also, that helps the oil to melt, and that will also speed up the rise time for the rolls. But you don't want it hot. You should be able to handle it like I'm doing here. And then just start setting your rolls in there. Okay, so now I'm going to cover these up and set them back out in the sun again and let them rise for at least another ½ an hour, and then I'm going to bake them. So I'll be back in a little bit. All right, so while the rolls are rising, I'll go ahead and get started on the icing. You can either do this at this point, or you can wait until you're actually baking the rolls. But again, it's something I want to get done right away. So my son's coming over in a bit for a haircut, so I need to get this done. So what I'm going to do is I have right here my homemade powdered sugar, and it's really easy to make your own powdered sugar. And if you're interested in how I do it, I'll go ahead and link to my how-to video up here and in the description box. So what you're going to want is about up to 1/4 to 1/2 cup of your powdered sugar. I'd say maybe 1/3 cup. What do I have here? Okay, well there's close to 1/2 cup right there. So that's probably good. You don't want to go any more than that because that's going to be quite a bit. But again, remember, I didn't put as much sugar in the dough as well, so I don't mind going a little higher on the sugar content. But again, this is powdered sugar, so it's probably really only about 1/4 cup. Okay, and then I'm going to take some more raspberries, and I'm going to make about another 1/4 cup of the powdered raspberries. Okay, and again, take your fork or your whisk and mix it together. And take a look at that color. Now, once you start adding a liquid to this, this is going to darken quite a bit. And I think that's about how much I did in my last icing recipe. I usually just throw this stuff together. And I don't actually keep track of how much I'm using of different things, but I'm thinking that looks about right. Besides, I'm also going to be adding some of my homemade raspberry extract. I got a little bit left. Well, I have more, another batch. So I'm going to be using that too, just to add a little bit more flavor. All right, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to be using some heavy whipping cream. This is an option. You can also just use plain water if you would rather do that. I like using the whipping cream because it just gives it more richness. But again, if you need to be dairy-free for whatever reason, plain water will work just fine. And so notice how I'm doing this is I'm pouring little bits in at a time. Again, you're working with powdered sugar, so if you're not careful, it's easy to get too much liquid. So before I put any more whipping cream in there, I'm going to put some of my homemade raspberry extract, that little bit that's left in there. And then I'll have to go strain out my next jar of it and add it in there. Okay, you can see that's already taken on almost a frosting right now, but I want it runnier than that because I want it to be able to, I want to be able to kind of drizzle it over my rolls once they're done. A little more of the heavy whipping cream, again, or water if you would prefer. You could even use like a juice, like a raspberry juice if you wanted to. And sometimes it's not even a bad idea just to add a tiny, tiny pinch of salt to this to help break up some of that sweetness and also to bring out the flavor of the fruit. I'll do that with some things. I'm not going to bother with it on this one. I'm going to put just a little bit more of that extract in there. So you can see how dark this color is turning. If I had added more raspberries to it, it would be much darker than that. Okay, it's almost the consistency I want. And then the one thing you want to keep in mind is you've got freeze-dried fruit in there. And so as this sits, it's going to get thicker. So actually now's a really good time to do this so it has time to sit. And then while your rolls are baking, you can check your consistency because right there, that's about how I like it when I go to put it on my rolls. The same thing applies when I'm doing a cinnamon roll. Depending on the type of cinnamon roll I'm doing, sometimes I like it a little bit runnier than that, but this is a pretty good consistency. Okay, so now we just got to wait for the rolls to finish rising, and then I'll show you what we do next. All right, so the rolls are all risen. You can see they've totally filled up the pan. And so now it's time to go ahead and put them in the toaster oven, or you can use your regular conventional oven. And I'm going to set the heat at 375 and bake for 25 to 30 minutes. So you want to check it at the 25-minute mark and see if maybe it needs to go longer. And if it starts to brown too much on top, at the 20 mark, you might want to check it then just go ahead and throw a little bit of foil over that and then let it finish out. Okay, I'll be back when these are done and I'm ready for the icing. All right, well, the rolls are all done. They got a little bit dark because I got distracted. I was cutting my son's hair, and so I didn't come back in and check on them like I should have. But they're still going to be good. It's mostly just the raspberry on the top that gets a little bit dark, so you want to keep that in mind. Now notice I took them right out of the cast iron pan. I find when you're baking breads of any kind in cast iron, take them out immediately. Otherwise they tend to sweat, and then it can cause the pan to rust. And then when you go to put your icing on, it really is best to do it while the rolls are still very warm. That way what it will do is it will melt down and go down into the cracks of your cinnamon rolls or your raspberry rolls, as the case is here. So start by just putting a dollop right on the top center of each one. And then you can see already that the heat is causing it to spread out. Then just kind of spread it around, let it run down the sides a little bit and all around in there. And that just makes it, will just make it really yummy, and it makes it look good too. And if you're like me and you look at this and you think, I'd like a little bit more, well, it's not that hard to whip up a little bit more of that icing, and then you can spread it around. But I think this is going to be good, just as is. Because actually on my last batch, I ended up with too much icing. It was still super good, but I really hadn't intended to have quite that much icing for the rolls. And then we'll just, as this sits, this will continue to run down the sides and all around. You can even kind of encourage it like that a little bit if you want. And Later I'll come in and I'll take the silicone spatula and scrape the rest of that out and put that in, but I need to finish this video up. So there we go. There's the homemade raspberry rolls using your freeze-dried raspberries from food storage. So don't forget, you can check in a link down below. I have a link to the Mother Earth Products, which is my favorite brand right now of freeze-dried and dehydrated goods. And if you go through my link, you can get 10% off your order, which is pretty cool. And also remember, you can even get just sample sizes if you just want to try different things in there to see if you even like it before you invest in a larger amount at a time. So I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new, and now you got a new treat to try out to give to your family. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.